Thank you all so much. If everybody can just hold up the book. I haven't even seen it until yesterday. So I'm so thrilled to be here to announce my new book, Radical Respect, with all of you all. I know that I gave a talk about radical candor in 2016. It was the talk that launched 1 million books. This is going to be the talk that launches 2 million books. So I'm thrilled to be here with all of you all. I decided to write Radical Respect shortly after Radical Candor came out. If you write a book about feedback, as I did, you're going to get a lot of it, and indeed I did. And hands down, the best feedback I got was when I was delivering a Radical Candor talk at a tech company in San Francisco. And the CEO of that company had been a friend of mine for the better part of a decade. She's a person I like and respect enormously, and she's one of too few black women CEOs in tech. And when I finished giving the Radical Candor talk, she pulled me aside and she said, "Kim, I'm really excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of innovative culture that I need in order to succeed. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you." And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer folks even the most compassionate, gentle criticism, they would call her an angry black woman. And I knew this was true as soon as she said it to me. It was, have you all ever been in a moment where you hear this feedback and you know it's true and it hits you in the gut and you've got to figure out what to do about it? I took a deep breath and I had 4 realizations at the same time because I knew this was so unfair to her. She's one of the most even-keeled, cheerful people I've ever worked with. And the first thing that I realized was that I had failed in my role as upstander. I had failed to be the kind of colleague that I want to be, that I imagine myself to be, because I want to notice when my colleagues are being treated disrespectfully and to do something about it. But in this case, I had failed ever to notice or to take into account the toll that must take on her to have to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting we had ever been in together, even though she had what to be pissed off about at work, as we all do. So I had failed to intervene. I had been kind of a silent bystander instead, or an oblivious bystander even, instead of an upstander. But I want to give myself a little grace and all of you a little bit grace, because we all fail sometimes in this regard. So this is about how to get it right next time. Now, the second thing I realized was that not only had I been in denial about the kinds of things that happened to her as a black woman in the workplace, I had also been in denial about the kinds of things that happened to me as a white woman in the workplace. Kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit, but I had been pretending that a whole host of things were not happening that were, in fact, happening. So as a person who was harmed by disrespectful attitudes and behaviors, I had failed to choose my response. Instead, I had just been in denial. And again, I don't want to like stand up here and beat myself up. We often are in denial about this kind of thing, because I didn't want to think of myself or my colleague as victims, because we have this strange attitude about victims. But even less than ever wanting to think of myself as a victim did I want to think of myself as the culprit. So the third thing that I realized was that I had been most deeply in denial about the times when I was the person who had caused other people harm with my disrespectful attitudes and behaviors, as we are all bound to do. So what can we do about it? Next time I committed to myself that I would acknowledge what I did wrong and make amends. And last but not least, I think of myself as a leader who creates these bullshit-free zones where everybody can do the best work of their life and build the best relationships of their career. But as a leader, by failing to admit that these kinds of disrespectful attitudes and behaviors were creeping into my team, I was unable to prevent them. So, okay, let's take a big breath. It's a big drink of water. But we are all in these roles all of the time. And sometimes we're in multiple of these roles at the same time. And only if we recognize it can we get to the place where I think we all together want to go. And that is a place of radical respect. So you know me, I love a good 2x2. So here's the radical respect 2x2 framework. Radical respect is what happens when you optimize for collaboration rather than coercion. And what could possibly go wrong here? Because nobody wants to be coerced at work. And I've never actually met a leader who said, I want to create a coercive work environment. I think we have a shared understanding that when we collaborate, we do more innovative work, we do our best work, we enjoy work more. That's the point of having a team, is collaboration, not coercion. Telling people what to do doesn't work, as I said in Radical Candor. The other thing about radical candor, the other thing about radical respect is honoring everyone's individuality. And I think we all expect to have our individuality honored when we go into work. And I think all of us think of ourselves as the kind of person who honors the individuality of others. And so what moves us in the wrong direction here? Again, I've never met anyone who says, I want to work in or I want to start a 1984 style, everybody's marching in lockstep kind of work environment. That is not what happens. But how do we somehow start demanding conformity from one another, even when we don't intend to? What gets in the way of radical respect? There's a lot of things, but I'm going to boil it down to 3. And I think it's bias, prejudice, and bullying. And I think part of the problem here is that we often conflate these 3 things as though they are the same thing. And then it's tempting to feel like we're facing this sort of monolithic, insoluble problem. But it is my experience that, here we are in Silicon Valley. We're really good here at breaking problems down in their component parts and solving them. So let's break this problem down and define each of these things carefully so that we can address them. Bias, I'm going to define as not meaning it. It's unconscious. Prejudice, on the other hand, is meaning it. This is a very consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype. And last but not least, there's bullying, which is just being mean. No belief, conscious or unconscious there whatsoever. So there's tons more to say about these things, but I find it useful in the moment to have definitions so that I can kind of figure out what I'm dealing with. Now, one of the many problems is that we feel gobsmacked when this stuff happens in a meeting. How many of you, raise of hands, have been in a meeting in the last 2 days where somebody said something and you're like, oh my God, what did he just say? What did she just say? What just came out of my mouth, his mouth, her mouth, their mouth? This happens. And we've got to get comfortable figuring out what we're going to say. So here are some simple ideas about what to say when you don't know what to say. First of all, bias. And you may not be sure what's going on, and that's okay. But if you think it's bias, try an I statement. An I statement kind of holds up a mirror so the other person becomes aware of what they're doing, and hopefully they'll knock it off. One of my favorite stories about an I statement comes from a colleague of mine who was going into a meeting with 2 colleagues who were men. She sat at the center of the table because she had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. Her 2 colleagues sat to her left. When the other side came in, the first person sat across from the guy to her left, the next person sat across from the guy to his left, and then everybody else filed on down the table, leaving her dangling by herself. Anybody ever notice bias show up in that way? It's often just who we decide to sit across from, next to. And she started talking, and when the other side had questions, they would direct them at her 2 colleagues who were men, not at her. Anybody ever notice? Yeah, there's some hands. That is often what happens. It happened once, it happened twice, it happened a 3rd time. And finally, one of her colleagues stood up and he said, I think we should just switch seats. That was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. He was sort of holding up a mirror to the other side, and they realized what they were doing, and they started engaging with her. And he did that for 3 important reasons. He did it, 1, because he wanted to win the deal. There's a practical element to this. There's also an emotional element to this. He did it because he liked her and he didn't like seeing her get ignored. And the 3rd reason that he chose to be such a great upstander in that moment was sort of an efficiency argument. It wasn't that she couldn't speak up for herself, but he knew it was going to be easier for them to hear it from him than from her. So that is a simple example of an I statement. Now, if it's prejudice, holding up a mirror is not going to work because the other person is going to grin in the mirror. They're going to like what they see. And so you've got to do something else. I think in the case of prejudice, you want an it statement. And an it statement can appeal to the law, it can appeal to an HR policy, or it can appeal to common sense. Here is an example of an it statement. I had just returned to work from maternity leave, and I was chit-chatting with a guy before a meeting, and he said to me, "Oh, my wife doesn't work because it's better for the children." And this, of course, was like a gut punch for me, but I didn't think he really meant it the way it sounded. And I said, "Oh," I tried an I statement, because I thought it was biased. I said, "Oh, I decided to show up at work today because I choose to neglect my children," you know, and I was expecting, that was what I was expecting from him. I was expecting him to laugh and then apologize and we would move on. But no, that's not what happened. What happened was he said, "Oh no, Kim, it is really not good that you are at work today, you know, and I'm going to send you some research." So now I know that this is a prejudice. This is a belief he has. And so at this company where I worked, there were lots of HR rules against this, so I was able to invoke them. And I said, "It is an HR violation for you to tell me that I am neglecting my children by showing up at work today." And that had the desired effect. Now he knew where the boundary was. But I had to work with him, and I didn't want to over-delegate to HR. So I said, "Look, I'm not going to make a thing of this with HR. But I think you and I can agree that it is now I'm appealing to common sense, it is my decision, together with my partner, how we raise our children, just as it is your decision with your wife, how you raise your children." And with that, he kind of agreed. He kind of was nodding. And I said, "Furthermore, I'm guessing you don't want to read my research any more than I want to read your research." And he said, "No." So we were able to work together. So that's an example of prejudice. You really do want to push back. You don't want to let people lay their prejudiced beliefs on you. Last but not least, bullying. This is where you want a you statement. And a you statement is very different than an I statement or an it statement. If somebody is bullying you and you use an it statement, you're showing them where a boundary is, you can be sure that they're going to try to kick past that boundary. So that's not going to work. And an I statement sort of brings someone in closer. And that is not what you want to do with a bully. You want to sort of push them away. I learned this from my daughter when she was in 3rd grade. She was getting bullied on the playground. And I said to her, as adults often do to kids, "Tell this child, you know, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah." And she banged her fist on the table and she said, "Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded?" I'm like, oh, that is a really good point. So in the case of bullying, you want a you statement. "You can't talk to me like that." Or, "What's going on for you here? Why are you doing this?" Kind of a you question. Or even a you non sequitur. "Where'd you get that shirt?" The idea of a you statement is you're now not accepting whatever it is that this person is dishing out. You're sort of pushing them away. You're in an active stance, asking them to engage with what you're saying. You're not engaging with what they're saying. Again, tons more to say about all of this, but I think this can really help. It can really help us as upstanders, and it can also really help us when this stuff is directed at us. Now, what I want to do is kind of double click on what upstanders can do. Because part of the reason why I wrote Radical Respect is in gratitude for the many upstanders that I've had in the course of my career who have really helped me out of tough moments. So what can you do as an upstander? There's an organization called Right to Be, and they recommend the 5 Ds. The first thing is you can say something directly, sort of like the guy in the meeting did. "I think she and I should switch seats." But that may not always be safe. And if you are an upstander, I don't want to put you in harm's way. So you could also delay. An example of delaying and why it is important comes from a moment in my career where I was giving a talk with 2 colleagues on stage in front of 5,000 people. And the leader of this organization introduced one colleague, shook his hand, introduced another colleague, shook his hand, and then introduced me, and I stuck my hand out for him to shake it. And instead, he grabbed it and kissed it, kind of licked it. It was like one of those cringe moments. And that was bad enough. But what was even worse was that nobody, not a single person in that group of 5,000 people that I was speaking to, came up to me afterwards and said, do you need a little hand sanitizer? Or, you know, that was weird, or you okay? And that kind of checking in with somebody can really dispel gaslighting, because I sort of felt afterwards, was it only me who thought that was weird? Like, didn't anybody else think it was weird? So that can be a really powerful thing you can do as an upstander, even if you don't feel like stepping on stage and saying, don't kiss her hand, don't lick her hand. Okay, which is understandable that nobody did that. All right, another thing you can do is you can create a distraction. Sometimes just spilling your coffee will give the person, create the space for the person that they need. You can also delegate. There's been a lot that's written about the silent bystander problem. So if there's a group of people who are observing something, catch someone else's eye and say, you know, can you step up and say something? And you can delegate up, down, and sideways. You don't have to delegate to some higher authority. It's often just about finding the right person, someone who's in a better position to intervene, to be the direct upstander. And last but not least, you can document. We're all carrying basically movie cameras around in our pockets. But remember, if you document what happened, it is the person harmed who owns that documentation, not you. All right. What can leaders do? Because it shouldn't be all on the people harmed or on upstanders. Leaders have some power, and they should use it to prevent disrespectful attitudes and behaviors. So what can leaders do to make responding expected? First of all, bias. It's really important that a leader sit down with their team and create an expectation that people will disrupt bias in the moment. Bias is a pattern, and we as human beings, we are pattern makers. And sometimes we make a good pattern, and other times we make a bad pattern. And if we do not disrupt the bad patterns in the moment, then we are reinforcing them. Then we're going to ensure that bias is going to happen again and again and again and again. And so we've got to disrupt it in the moment. This is not public criticism. This is like a public correction. In the case of prejudice, you've got to create, as a leader, a space for conversation. It is really easy for me to stand up here on stage and say, there's a line between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose their belief on others. It is actually pretty hard to know exactly where that line is. And so you want to talk to your team and figure it out. My recommendation here is take some stories of disasters that have happened elsewhere and imagine what would you as a team do if you were in those leaders' place. I write in the book, there's several write-ups of disastrous situations that you can imagine yourself in. Last but not least, bullying. It's really important that leaders create consequences for bullying. You want conversational consequences. You want to shut it down in the moment. You also want to create compensation consequences. It's really important that you not give high ratings or bonuses to people who bully others. And there's a great rule at Atlassian called the No Brilliant Jerks rule. And at Atlassian, no matter how good your results are, if it emerges from your 360 that you have bullied others, you get a bad rating. That is really important. And last but not least, there've got to be career consequences. It is essential that leaders not promote people who indulge in bullying. For some reason, I think there's this misperception that bullying is a leadership attribute. It is not. Very clear. So the moment a leader promotes someone who bullies others, that is the moment when the jerks begin to win and the culture begins to lose. Instead, a leader should give that person feedback, and if they cannot knock it off, if they can't quit bullying others, it is incumbent upon the leader to fire that person. And this can be hard. Sometimes this person feels essential to the team, but you know what? It's better to have a hole than an asshole. Full stop. So there you go. All right. Now, I want, you have these purple flags on the for those of you at tables. Wave your purple flag. So here is the point of the purple flag. Disrupting bias, you can do it. And you don't have to be the manager of a team. You can be a different kind of leader on the team. But you can work with your team to disrupt bias in 3 steps. The first step is to have a shared vocabulary. You want to make sure that people know what they're going to say. And I like the purple flag. You can wave the purple flag. It's a friendly purple flag. It's not an orange flag. It's not a yellow flag. And so on my team, if I say something that is biased, someone will just wave the purple flag. And we'll talk in a minute about what I do next. But it doesn't have to be a purple flag. You need to talk to your team and figure out what is the word or phrase or sort of object you're going to use to disrupt bias in the moment. One team I worked with would throw up a peace sign. Another team had kind of a cat theme going on. They would meow at each other. Whatever it is, you just need to make sure that everybody understands the word or phrase, that it's a shared vocabulary. The second thing you need to do is you need a shared norm. What do you do or say when it's you whose bias has been disrupted? The story I told at the beginning of this presentation was, I imagine, a little bit uncomfortable for a lot of people. We feel ashamed. At least I feel deeply ashamed. When someone points out to me that I have said or done something biased, I feel shame. I can tell you where I feel it in my body. It's like a tingling in the backs of my knees. It's the same feeling that I get if my children walk too close to the edge of a precipice. And this is bad. Like, shame is not really a helpful thing, because when I'm in shame brain, I'm in a fight or flight mode, and my executive function shuts down. And I am not alone. I think this happens to almost everyone. And so teaching your team how to move out of shame brain, and I have got to own my own shame and move through it. There's no words you can use that are going to not trigger that. Like, it's on me to manage my shame. So one of the things that you could do is just teach people to say, thank you for pointing it out. Like, that begins to re-engage the executive function. And then there's one of two things. Either I get it, and I'll work on not doing it again, or I don't get it. And this is doubly hard, because now I'm ashamed because I've hurt someone, and I'm ashamed because I'm ignorant. I don't know what I did wrong. So you want to make sure that you are preparing people to move through those feelings, because we are all bound to feel this way sometimes. That's the only way out of this discomfort is through. And last but not least, you've got to have a shared commitment. It's easy to say, oh, let's wave the purple flag, but you're not going to do it unless you are prepared to embrace the discomfort and to build stamina for doing this. There's nothing, I do not have emotional Novocaine. I promise I would give it to you if I had it, but this is hard. Now, I want to take just a couple more minutes to talk about what happens when power enters the equation. And then I will answer questions, and I'll answer more questions at the book signing. But what happens when power enters the equation? This is when things go from bad to worse. This is when we get discrimination, harassment, and physical violations. Prejudice or bias plus power yields discrimination. This is what happens when bias finds its way into hiring systems, promotion systems, pay systems. Harassment happens when you've got bullying plus power. And when you've got physical touch plus power, you get physical violations, whether it is the unwanted hair sniff or worse. So what can leaders do to prevent this kind of illegal behavior? I think bias quantifiers at every stage of the employee life cycle can really help. I think in our management systems, it's really important to have checks and balances. When one person has unilateral decision-making power over who gets hired, who gets fired, who gets promoted, who gets paid bonuses, bad things are more likely to happen. And to prevent physical violations, you need a culture of consent. This basically just means, if I want to touch you, it's my job to know if you want to be touched. And if you don't want to be touched, I don't touch, even if it's just a handshake. And if I'm not sure, don't touch. It's like not that complicated, and yet this needs to be reinforced. It works really well in kindergarten. It works less well in the workplace. So I don't know why, but I'm sure we can fix it. All right, last but not least, what do you do if your leaders are not doing those good things? How can you speak truth to power without blowing up your career? And I have an idea that I would love to get your all's feedback on. So you can put it in the Slido, or you can send me an email, Kim at radicalrespectbook.com. I would love to know what we can do to build communities for people who are experiencing these things and trying to figure out how to speak truth to power without blowing up their careers, because it feels so risky. So I'm going to offer some suggestions. One, document what is happening. That is a great, even if you're not going to use it in a lawsuit, it's a great way to dispel gaslighting. Two, build solidarity. There's so much evidence that if you have even one friend at work, you do better work, you're happier at work, and you're less likely to get gaslit. And last, locate the exit nearest you. I think we often feel more trapped than we in fact are. But if you're going to do the next things I suggest, you want to know what your best alternative to a negotiated agreement is. You want to know your BATNA. So you can also talk directly, unless you feel that it's unsafe, physically unsafe. But often it's safer than you think to just tell this person what they did wrong. Sometimes they'll actually just knock it off. I know that sounds radical and it won't always happen, but more often than you think, there's a possibility. You could also report this to HR. Now, HR is supposed to help you solve the problem, and often they will, but also want to acknowledge that often they won't. So you want to make sure you understand the HR landscape. You can take legal action, and you can tell your story. The thing that gives me more optimism than anything else is that since the Black Lives Matter movement, since the Me Too movement, since the Stop Asian Hate movement, since the gay rights movement, so many people have told their stories, and that has helped them build solidarity. So, and you're much more likely to be believed and to find real compassion, I think, than you were 30 years ago. So even though we still got a lot of problems, I think we are on the path to solving them. All right, I have like 3 minutes for questions. So I know there's some on the Slido. So I'd love to, if they're up here, I don't see them. Anybody want to just ask a question? Oh, here we go. What if the leader is the one engaging in the bullying? Yes, it's much more likely that a leader is going to bully others than someone who's not a leader. And one of the things that I tried to do in the book is tell stories when I was the bully. Because you know what? We all sometimes do this. And so I think the most important thing you can do are those first 3 things. Document what's happening. Build some solidarity with people at your team. Figure out, can I get another job? Can I sleep on somebody's couch? And then go talk directly to that person with someone else. Often they don't think of themselves as bullies. And so realizing what they're doing is that you're actually giving them a great gift. Other times they're going to respond very badly, so that's why you want to locate the exit nearest you before having this conversation. But sometimes radical candor actually works in this case. All right, question number 2. How do you approach bullying and or prejudice in online communities, especially when you aren't in a role to delete comments and block people? This, I imagine you all have more expertise around this than I do, but I will say a couple of things. One, there's a tale of 2 companies that I've been watching lately. Look at what's happened to Twitter and look at what happened to Reddit. When Reddit started moderating their communities, they were able to go public. When Twitter stopped content moderation, we've seen what's happened to the platform and to the valuation of the platform. So content moderation has real value. But what if you're not in control of the platform? One of the things that I have found works is the conventional wisdom is to ignore the trolls. But often I have found that the person is actually not trolling me. So if I try to respond to, and sometimes, I just turn off comments. But if it's a few of them, like there was the other day, somebody said on LinkedIn, oh, we don't have any problems with bias, prejudice, and bullying anymore after you two, after Me Too and Black Lives Matter. And my husband was like, he's trolling you. And I was like, I'm not sure he is. And so I said, why don't we talk offline? And he really believed that, actually. And then I sort of talked to him for a little bit, and he's like, oh, I better talk to my company. This stuff is still happening. I'm like, yes, you're not doing it, but it's not happening to you, so you're not aware of it. So sometimes helping people understand what's really happening is useful. There's a wonderful story in the book about Lindsay West, who wrote about what a troll was doing to her, and he wrote her back and apologized, but before he apologized, like, he acknowledged what he did wrong, he deleted all those accounts, he donated money in her father's name to a cancer research center. So sometimes people behave better when you approach them. But you get to decide whether it's your job to ignore them or to engage them if you're the person harmed by disrespect. All right, tons more questions. I'm happy to answer them at the book signing or send me an email. Thank you all so much.